Are Christians standing on good ground when they say that the tomb was in fact found empty on the third day? Let's get into it. I want to flag a couple of objections right here at the front of the video. The first one being that we do not even know where Jesus was buried, but we'll get to that later in the video. The one I want to respond to right now is the fact that Paul does not mention an empty tomb in any of his letters, and his letters are the earliest Christian sources that we have, so it seems to be a later development in the Christian tradition. But this is a very weak argument from silence, because Paul does mention the burial of Jesus and the subsequent post-resurrection appearances in an incredibly early Christian creed found in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. This creed serves as a summary for the Christian message for early Christians to memorize and pass on. Just because this creed does not take the time to mention, oh, by the way, he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, this does not mean that Paul was unaware of this part of the tradition. And on top of that, we have really strong reasons for affirming the empty tomb as historical, so an argument from silence simply isn't going to work. So what are our reasons for believing in the empty tomb as historical? First, we'll look at the early attestation to the event. The empty tomb is mentioned in the resurrection accounts of all four Gospels. And it's important to note that in the resurrection narratives, the Gospels are not literarily dependent upon one another. This may surprise many, because most assume that Matthew and Luke are totally dependent upon Mark for a lot of their material. But this is where a concept called partial dependence needs to be fleshed out. Partial dependence refers to when a document is dependent on another source for some of their material, even if it's a large portion, but not all of their material. For example, when Matthew uses Mark as a source, even though it's for a large portion of his gospel, this does not mean that he is totally dependent upon Mark for all of his information. And why should we believe that he's totally dependent upon Mark, especially if he is in fact Matthew and he was one of Jesus' disciples? We can say that Matthew himself can be an independent source. And why would we also assume that he couldn't talk to other people? There's no reason to assume that Matthew is totally dependent upon Mark. In other words, we can say that he is partially dependent. The reason we know the gospel authors are independent of one another for the resurrection passages is because they do not show signs of textual dependence. And there are prima facie tensions in the text. And what I mean by prima facie tensions is that if you read the narratives at face value, you will see some tensions in the text that need to be resolved, whether by literary devices or harmonization. Skeptics have argued for centuries that these tensions are irreconcilably contradictory. It's not within the scope of this video to show that these tensions are not in fact contradictions. However, I bring it up now because it serves as evidence of literary independence. In other words, we have multiple independent attestation in at least 4 sources for the empty tomb. Historians also believe that the narrative of the empty tomb has historical plausibility because of the criterion of embarrassment. And you might be asking, what exactly is embarrassing about the discovery of the empty tomb? Jesus' disciples abandoned him. They were scattering. The Jesus movement was over. If it wasn't for the women going to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body on Sunday morning, who knows what would have happened with the Christian movement? And on top of this, the testimony of women was not deemed as trustworthy in Jesus' day. And so why, if they were making up the story, would they say that women were the ones that discovered the tomb? This argument regarding the criterion of embarrassment has convinced a lot of historians and New Testament scholars that the narrative of the empty tomb is in fact a historical one. And this leads us to our second line of evidence for why we can affirm that the discovery of the empty tomb was a historical event. And it's that early opponents of Christianity presupposed the empty tomb in their objections to Christianity. We see our first and earliest glimpse of this in Matthew 28, where it says, "After they had assembled with the elders and formed a plan, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came at night and stole his body while we were asleep. If this matter is heard before the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story is told among the Jews to this day." Notice, in an attempt to argue against the resurrection, they're saying that Jesus' body was stolen by his disciples. And you have to ask, where were they stealing his body from? And why were the soldiers involved? If Jesus' body was thrown in a mass grave or buried somewhere in secret, there would be no soldiers involved in the story, and there would be no need to make up a narrative about stealing his body. And when we look in the 2nd century, in Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, in chapter 108, it says, "A godless heresy had sprung up from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified. But his disciples stole him by night from the tomb, where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he is risen from the dead and ascended into heaven." We can even see in later writings that this rumor persisted for centuries. In the 500s, in the Toledoth Yeshu, it says, "Diligent search was made, and he, Jesus, was not found in the grave where he had been buried. A gardener had taken him from the grave, and had brought him into his garden, and buried him in the sand over which the waters flowed into the garden." So we have the early Christians attesting to the fact that the tomb was discovered empty on the third day, and then we have the opponents of Christianity presupposing the empty tomb when they're arguing against Christianity. But we're not done yet. We have a third line of evidence, and I'm going to call this external corroboration. And for this, we're going to look to archaeology and the Nazareth inscription. This is an inscription that is typically dated to the first half of the 1st century, which says, "You are absolutely not to allow anyone to move those who have been entombed. But if someone does, I wish that violator to suffer capital punishment under the title of tomb breaker." But notice how the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Why would there be a death penalty for moving someone's body from a tomb? Could it be because of the rumors that the Jewish people were spreading about Jesus' body being stolen? I think so. Now, with these 3 lines of independent evidence for the empty tomb narratives being historical ones, why would anyone doubt their historicity? Well, there's one more major objection I want to get to, and it's this. The regular practice for crucifixion in the Roman Empire outside of Judea at the time of Jesus was to have the crucifixion victims either rot or be eaten by animals on the cross and then be thrown into a mass grave. Or if the Jewish people did take them off the cross, they would be buried somewhere in private. And so no one would have known where Jesus was buried. So, the skeptics say, the burden of proof is on us to show that in Judea, the practice was different for the burial and the empty tomb narratives to be considered historical. They're basically saying in the Roman Empire at the times of Jesus, everywhere outside of Judea would not have let someone be buried off of a cross. The first thing to say in way of response to this is that the regular practice of a particular area is quite often different than the standard practice of surrounding areas. You could probably think of a city near you that has something it does that is quite unique to its subculture. For the province of Judea in the Roman Empire, it was unique because this is where the temple was located, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all of the temple rituals. And also, Jesus' ministry happened during peacetime. So we should actually expect that there would be some unique practices surrounding Judaism in this province of Judea. It shouldn't surprise us at all, actually. But if the skeptic wants to insist that I have the burden of proof, even though I've already given all of these lines of evidence for the empty tomb narratives being historical, I'll oblige. Because, in fact, we have strong reasons for believing the burial narratives in the Gospels are also historical. Let's begin with early attestation for the burial of Jesus. Now, we have to be careful here. Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source in large parts of their Gospels, including in the burial narrative. John was also aware of the other Gospels before writing his own. So it'd be too hasty to say that we have 4 independent sources attesting to the burial in the Gospels. Though we can say that it is mentioned in all 4 Gospels, and the man who buried Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, is named in all of them as the man who buried him. Are we going to just say they're all making it up? And even though John was familiar with the other Gospels, it is largely agreed that he wrote independently of them. So if we were to just look at the burial narratives themselves, we can say that we have at least 2 independent sources attesting to the event. But can we go further than this? I believe we can. While it might be the case that there is some literary dependence for the burial narrative, as we've already mentioned, in the resurrection narratives or the empty tomb narratives, they are independent of one another. But here's the thing, the empty tomb or resurrection narratives presuppose that Jesus was buried in a known location. He was not thrown in a mass grave or buried in secret. So it turns out that we actually can say that we have 4 independent sources of a known burial location of Jesus within the Gospels themselves. And again, we have early attestation to the burial of Jesus in 1 Corinthians 15, and there's also an allusion to Jesus' empty tomb in a sermon that Peter preaches in Acts chapter 2. He contrasts Jesus' resurrection with David's tomb, which he says is here to this day, which is a clever way of saying that Jesus' tomb was not with them today, meaning that his was empty. And just like we saw with the resurrection narratives, we have external corroboration for the burial ones as well. Josephus in the War of the Jews says, "Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial. Although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men, that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. I should not mistake if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city." Notice how he's saying, Before war times, before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Jews would take crucified victims down and bury them before the going down of the sun, just like the Gospels attest for us. We can also look to archaeology to show that within the first century in the province of Judea, crucifixion victims would get an honorable burial. In 1968, a heel bone of a crucifixion victim named Yehohanan, son of Hagkal, was found in an ossuary. We know he was crucified because the nail from his crucifixion was still lodged in his heel bone. The ossuary was found in western Jerusalem and dates to the 1st century. Notice how with both the empty tomb and the burial narrative, there is testimony claiming that they are historical, alongside either corroborating testimony or archaeological evidence. In order to reject these narratives as historical, one would need very good reasons, especially when one keeps in mind that the common sense approach to testimony is the anti-reductionist approach. All this means is that without defeating reasons, we should trust testimony. And this is the way that we all operate within our ordinary lives if we engage in some self-reflection. It's very natural for us to trust the testimony of others, and without good reasons for thinking someone is lying, we usually do. But when the reasons seem to be a weak argument from silence or appeals to the practices outside of the specialized location that we are investigating, the bar for rejection simply has not been met. Therefore, one should accept the burial and empty tomb narratives in the Gospels to be historical. Thank you so much for watching this video defending the empty tomb and burial narratives of Jesus Christ as historical. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.